You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Simon Lusk is a seasoned political consultant and an expert on campaigning. With the advent of Labor's nasty negative campaigning, I thought I'd get him back on The Crunch to discuss in depth how negative campaigning can be successful, and we will rate the New Zealand attempts at negative campaigning. Welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Cam.
Yeah, so it's all big news this week after the CTU has run attack ads in the Herald, and we had, of course, David Seymour running attack ads against Winston Peters, and the media have sort of woken up to this revelation that there's such a thing as negative campaigning. But you and I we've run our own negative campaigns in the past, and it's nothing new for us. So I thought we'd share with the RCR listeners your views on negative campaigning and whether it's worthwhile and effective.
Oh, well, the first thing is absolutely it is extremely worthwhile and it is very effective. It is a crucial part of the campaigner's toolbook, and you're basically negligent if you're not willing to use it. It's a proven and well-tested method in the rest of the world, especially in the US, where the campaigning has actually got a whole lot cleaner. In the 1800s, they used to put out absolutely slanderous brochures about their opponents that were just made up. Now it at least has a degree of truth in it. And it really just works. And it works because it emphasises what people tend to think anyway about a politician. And it usually works because it's truthful. You can't say stuff about someone else that isn't truthful. You get nailed in defamation. So you've got to be truthful. And there's research, and I'm not sure how contemporary research goes, but it's saying it's 4 times more truthful than the biographical pieces that politicians put out about themselves, which are, basically puff pieces and bullshit. If you're going to run a negative campaign, you've got to tell the truth about someone.
Yeah, exactly. So how come New Zealand is backwards, really, in coming forwards on negative campaigning?
There's a series of reasons, but the biggest one is the lack of professionalism in New Zealand politics. We're a very amateur place. The money spent here is not high. The quality of our politicians is not high. They don't fundraise properly, and then they don't run decent campaigns based on having good data. And our mate Farrod should be involved in just about every campaign, telling people how to use data properly. They don't, Nationals, we're blue dot. Well, they never have a get out the vote. Obama spent $100 million in 2012 on his data alone, and that was just to do the get out the vote. We're amateur. We've all got to be nice to each other. Well, that's not the real world, and we'd be a far better place if we actually emphasise some of the failings of some political parties. Although you do have to be a bit careful about it. I mean, the classic example of where negative campaigning didn't work was Pauline Hanson in Australia, where when she first came on the scene, she'd say something outrageous, everyone would go nuts about it, and her poll rating would go up. And at one point, one of the senior ministers in the Australian government came out and said, look, we're all just going to stop talking about Pauline Hanson. If we ignore her, her poll rating will go down. And that message got widely published. No politicians talked about her. And, being Australia, they put her in jail as well. But she got let out because the conviction was dodgy. But they absolutely hammered her by ignoring her. So that wasn't a negative campaign. It was no campaign. Just ignore her. So some of the time, ignoring is better than negative.
Well, that's what I couldn't work out with David Seymour and the ACT Party's attacks on Winston Peters. They actually had a nice photo of Winston with a smile on his face and a quote on the billboards that he could easily have said. And so it ended up looking like a New Zealand First ad instead of an ACT Party ad.
Yeah, and I think your criticism is probably a bit generous. Whoever put that ad up really needs to be punished severely because there was ambiguity in it. if they wanted to get the message out that Winston was a risk or something, they needed to be much clearer. I mean, I looked at that ad and a whole lot of people said to me, "Oh, has Winston got billboards up in central Auckland?" And, well, I don't know. And they sent me that one. I had a look at it, and it's an ACT ad, and I couldn't tell immediately. It was a very inept ad.
Ineptness in politics is the undoing of many politicians. Unfortunately, we have an ineptocracy.
Yeah, we do. We're just not professional at all about it. And we've seen a series of people that wanted to be prime minister thinking they would get there like Jacinda by being lovely people, and they just weren't, and they got hammered. And that's most opposition leaders.
So in the US, they campaign on with negative ads, especially on the failures or poor results on policy. They use the record of the politician, don't they, extensively?
Yeah, and not only that, they so they hold people to account, but they also force people to vote on stuff that they know won't pay in their electorate. So there's a whole lot of congressional votes that are absolutely meaningless. It's never going to get into law, but it's one side wants the other side to say, well, or to vote on something that they know isn't popular. And the classic example at the moment is really tough abortion laws are very, very unpopular, even with Republican voters. So the Democrats are trying to line people up to put in a 6-week abortion ban because they know they can win votes off it. If it's in Congress has no ability to change abortion laws, but they can vote on abortion laws, and it just won't go anywhere. Impeachment on Biden. There's a whole lot of Republicans who have districts that voted for Biden are very worried about an impeachment because it could cost them their seats. I don't think that Biden's team will be. They don't want to be impeached, but they will be able to make a play for those 23 seats by saying these idiots voted for impeachment when Biden hadn't done anything wrong and was trying to fix the economy. So let's get rid of them. And that's a setup that is something that I'm sure there's plenty of Democratic strategists are ready to go in those 23 seats with.
A lot of the negative campaigning in the US seems to involve personalities and flaws in their personality. And I guess one of the most recent ones that I can remember was when John Kerry was standing and the Swift Vote Veterans for Truth came out and launched an attack ad against John Kerry based on his alleged service in Vietnam, and seriously impinged his ability to get anywhere on that.
Yeah, although the Republicans did walk away from that because there were a whole lot of veterans who were offended by it. The rules around Purple Hearts are you basically just need to bleed. So yes, he was. He won a Purple Heart, and I think after 3 injuries or 3 Purple Hearts, you get taken out of service, and they weren't major injuries. But I'm pretty sure that George W. Bush came out and said, "Look, this has got to stop," which sometimes does happen, where it's gone a bit overboard. The far more effective attack on Kerry, and I'm sure you're going to share this ad, was the one of him windsurfing and changing direction, and that is just absolutely, Kerry voted for this, and then he voted against it, and then he voted for it again. And they run through about half a dozen things where he's just changing direction on his windsurfer, changing direction on his votes. And that was a wonderful ad. And the flip-flopping of Kerry was something that they used to define him.
I'm George W. Bush, and I approve this message.
In which direction would John Kerry lead? Kerry voted for the Iraq War, opposed it, supported it, and now opposes it again. He bragged about voting for the $87 billion to support our troops before he voted against it. He voted for education reform and now opposes it. He claims he's against increasing Medicare premiums, but voted 5 times to do so. John Kerry, whichever way the wind blows.
And that's where it comes down to, isn't it? Because elections are effectively a referendum on the government.
Yeah, or a choice between leaders. So at the moment, National really want this to be a referendum on the government because the government is about the worst in living memory, if not the worst ever. They've just managed to fail on everything, and National haven't prosecuted that case. And all Labor have got is Hipkins is way more likeable than Luxon, and people are just not sure about Luxon, and so they want it to be a choice between Hipkins and Luxon. And National want it to be a referendum that, if COVID came back and we're all locked down and we still had the election and Luxon couldn't get out, it'd probably help him like it helped Biden.
Yeah.
But Hipkins, in my view, has made a terrible mistake in having the debates, head-to-head debate with Luxon on the 12th of October, because at least half of people will have voted by then and the election's over. He should have been demanding 3 debates with Luxon starting now and, really emphasising the difference between the two, because there's not much else Labor has.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? They can't run on their record. They haven't delivered 100,000 Kiwi-build houses. They haven't planted 1 billion trees. They haven't materially reduced child poverty. They haven't built the light rail to the airport. They haven't built the bridge across Auckland Harbour. There's a whole lot of things they haven't done. They can hardly run on their record. But on the other hand, we're not seeing the National Party prosecuting the government for their failures. Sure, they're doing a little bit on crime, and Erica Stanford's been doing sterling work about school truancy. But the massive amounts of waste. Just last week there was the Education Ministry of Education having millions and millions of masks in storage, costing something like $27,000 a month to store, and they're about to expire. You've got the rat tests, $500 million on rat tests, and we're not seeing the opposition prosecuting these failures.
And, I think that we've both acknowledged that Helen Clark is probably the best politician in our lifetime. She's just wonderful. And I think if we remember back to the pressure she had Shipley's government under from about 97 to 99, everyone just thought that Shipley was hopeless and her government was useless. And, that was my wonderful polls professor said to me, that when you're prosecuting the case as the opposition, you've got to make the government fear going into the House. And I'm sure that the National Party didn't enjoy going into the House when Helen Clark was just smashing them for their continued incompetence. And I don't see Labor going into the House in fear. And they should be, because they've got a disgraceful record. And I'm not talking about the stuff that your listeners care about. I'm just talking about the big stuff like the 100,000 houses, the light rail, the school truancy. Those things are just, everyone can see that it's terrible. It's just, and instead of like that should have been the last probably 2 years. National should have just been pounding them in the House, so they didn't want to go in there.
Probably the best pounding that we can remember is when Lockwood Smith was prosecuting Taito Phillip Field, and Helen Clark was not enjoying going into the House every day to answer questions about a dodgy minister.
And Lockwood did a wonderful, wonderful job. And the even better example is, and probably the best example of an opposition prosecuting a government is Tony Abbott just completely rinsed the Labor Party and almost got back into power after 3 years. And that was just perfect. He and his slogans were really simple. It was a great campaign. You knew exactly what he was standing for, and it just emphasised that Labor really weren't fit to run the country. And if it hadn't been for the 3 independents in very right-wing seats signing up with Labor, he would have got there in 2010, not 2013. And that's the model. But Helen Clark was as good as Tony Abbott, if not, she was much better as Prime Minister. And that's the kind of thing that a true negative campaign would have been, just highlighting the truth about Labor. And every day in the House, just like, don't ask Hipkins any questions. Ask the useless Education Minister what's happened to all the truancy, or the even more useless Transport Minister about all the potholes, or why he's wasted so much money on light rail and it's never going to get built. the only question to ask the leader is, do you have confidence in all your ministers after you've demonstrated that they can't run a bath, let alone a ministry?
Well, that's the thing I could never understand. In the early days of the Ardern regime, is that various leaders from Bill English to Simon Bridges to Todd Muller, they all just stood there and asked questions of Ardern, and I just was staggered that they continued to do that, and she was competent enough answering questions to bat them away easily. And they would have been far better to do exactly what you said. Ignore Ardern so she sits there. She can't flap her arms and flap her gums. She can't answer any questions. Same with Robertson, same with Hipkins. Ignore them and go after the dullards and the dolts that are within the ministry, and just harass them and break them. And we did see that, though, with Melissa Lee when she went after Claire Curran, and it wrecked her, absolutely wrecked her.
For the life of me, I can't understand how that useless prick from Te Atatu managed to stay in. Useless Phil. What's his name?
Mr. Twyford, as Stephen Joyce used to call him.
I mean, I think he was trying to build the light rail and 100,000 houses, and he didn't get close to doing any of them. I mean, I would have had him up on both of those every day, just incessantly. And Labor's backbenchers would have been cowering in fear after a few weeks of that, because they just know he hasn't got any answers.
It would have been simple. Every week you say, you get the housing minister, how many Kiwi build houses have been built this week?
Yeah.
The answer would have been week after week after week, none.
Yep.
None.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and then of course that leads into the ability to run attack ads and run negative campaigning based on their abject failure, on their record. And that's really the perfect areas, isn't it, that you can attack people on, is their record, because it's undeniable. These are the facts.
Yeah, there's also a degree of theatre and a degree of just emphasising what the instinctive feel about someone is. And the first really negative campaign ad in the modern era was Johnson's Daisy ad, when he was running against Goldwater in 1964. And the daisy ad, which I'm sure you're going to share, is a little girl plucking the leaves off a daisy, and an atomic bomb going off, because Goldwater had said he was going to lob an atomic bomb into the men's room at the Kremlin. And just to emphasise that point, it ran once. It scandalised America, got endless free play on all the media channels, and Goldwater probably wasn't going to run, but it just emphasised that he was a bit of a loose cannon.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 10,
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Zero.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Yeah, and, LBJ was a master of the negative campaigning, and he did do some pretty terrible things. And I'm told, without actually knowing, that Texas was a pretty terrible place in the 60s. They did all sorts of dodgy stuff. But, Johnson, to beat some strong incumbent in Texas, spread around a rumour that one of his opponent committed bestiality. And Johnson, someone hit Johnson up and said, "Mate, you can't say this." And he said, "It's not true." And Johnson said, "Well, I know it's not true, but I just want to hear that bastard deny that he f***s pigs." That's going a bit far, but it's an example of a negative campaign that actually worked. Johnson won a race that perhaps he wouldn't have otherwise.
And it was brutal and it was in your face, but it's legendary, that statement. And, we use it in the vernacular in politics all the time, and people will probably be upset with, a swear word or anything, but that's an actual quote from Lyndon Johnson. It's what he said. And that's what his aim was, to make his opponent deny doing something disgusting.
And there would have been much more to it than that. That wouldn't have been the only thing that helped Johnson win. But it was, it's just put your opponent under pressure. And, the next really great set of negative campaigns was the 1988 presidential election, where
they were brilliant, weren't they? Just brilliant.
Bush was really lagging after the primaries. He had no money. He basically was getting a hiding from Dukakis. And he ran a couple of the best campaign ads ever. The Willie Horton ad, because someone had asked Dukakis, well, if your wife was raped and murdered, would you want the death penalty? He gave a really technocratic answer. And he'd given a weekend release to a rapist who went out and raped and murdered someone called Willie Horton. And the controversy was Willie Horton was this big, scary-looking black guy, and they said it was a racist ad. But it had the truth behind it, because Dukakis had given weekend leave passes for prisoners, and Willie Horton did go out and commit some pretty terrible crimes. And that ad helped change the dynamics of the race.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
There's another one that was Dukakis in a tank, and people say, well, Dukakis shouldn't have been in a tank in a tie because he looks like a Muppet. But the ad itself talks about all the stuff that he's claimed and then hasn't done or opposed on funding the military. And that was this guy is not only a bit of an idiot, but he doesn't support our military. It was very, very effective attack ad.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber and a ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
Bush went on to win quite easily because he'd made himself look a whole lot better than his opponent.
Well, that's the thing, is politicians tend to do these stunts, don't they? They, the famous one of Don Brash walking the plank and then trying to get his extremely tall frame into a very tiny speedway car. Yeah. And it made Don Brash look awkward, out of touch, unbalanced, all of those things in just 2 30-second clips, but they were never really turned into attack ads. It was more the media focused on it rather than the opposition.
Well, there's a legend in politics that David Shearer holding up the snapper in Parliament was a setup by Cunliffe's people to make him look like an idiot. I don't know whether it's true or not, but if I was Cunliffe's people, I'd definitely put it around so I could take some credit for doing something good. And that was just an example, like walking the plank or the car, which just should never have happened. It just absolutely should never have happened. And it allowed the message that Dom, who's a friend of both of ours, and we absolutely love to bits, he's a great guy, just wasn't quite fit to be Prime Minister. And, it was the end for Shearer because it was a stunt too far. And National didn't have to run any ads. And, they didn't have to run negative ads against Cunliffe because everyone had worked out that guy was just horrible.
Well, he did it to himself when he said he was sorry for being a man.
Yeah, it's just like, well, mate, you might as well have left the election. Now, there's other examples of negative attack ads that that probably haven't worked and are really beyond the pale. And I'm pretty sure George W. Bush apologised to John McCain when some people associated with him push-polled in South Carolina saying, would you still vote for John McCain if he'd fathered an illegitimate black child? Now, he hadn't. He'd adopted a Bangladeshi daughter, so people sort of knew, but it wasn't determinative, but it just Bush wasn't happy with it. And it just wasn't a good move. It was a step too far and it was a bit out of touch. But that's what happens when you have people that are outside interest groups running the campaigns, because Bush was pretty unhappy with Swift Boat Veterans for Truth too, because it highlighted that Kerry had actually gone and served and Bush had got a deferment and gone to the National Guard and hadn't been to Vietnam. And so it was turn this around a bit on Kerry. Don't make one of his strengths his strength. Try and make it a weakness. But the Democrats didn't really want to hammer Bush on. They couldn't come out and say Bush was a coward. He used his influence to not go to Vietnam. But that's what they really meant, or they wanted to say.
Well, the other thing is there was an attack on McCain too, and I don't remember who did it exactly, but was mocking him how he couldn't raise his arms above his hands above his shoulders, and they didn't realize that McCain had actually been brutally tortured when he was captured in Vietnam, and as a result, he couldn't physically raise his hands above his shoulders because of the injuries from that, and it just backfired on the guy that attacked him for it.
His arms were broken, and but then it didn't really backfire on Trump when he said he liked the war heroes who weren't captured. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think Trump was just blessed by a truly awful opponent rather than doing anything particularly special himself. Yeah, and probably one of the best and most underrated negative campaigns. And Obama's team were generations ahead of everyone else in terms of their campaigning. But Romney, as usual, when you finish your primary, you've run out of money. He couldn't get on the airways over the summer. So Obama's team ran a whole lot of ads criticising Romney for being out of touch, and I'm pretty sure they had people who Romney's company Bain Capital had bought the firm and then offshored it, so lots of people got laid off, talking about how Romney had sacked them, and there's a really terrible photo of Romney with the piles of cash at Bain Capital with his colleagues that got lots of airtime, and Romney didn't help by getting recorded saying that 47% of Americans were basically takers and didn't contribute anything. And the Democrats really hammered that. And by the time Romney had some money in the spring to start advertising, he'd been defined, and it was very hard not to be defined as what Obama had chosen to. And Obama ended up winning relatively comfortably. I mean, it wasn't a dominating win like his previous win, but he still won comfortably. And a lot of that was because he ran a wonderfully negative campaign framing Romney in 2012 over the summer before Romney could hit the airwaves.
And I remember too, that was one of the first data-driven campaigns at the time. And, you and I were both following what Nate Silver was doing, and with polling and analysing the numbers. And I had a very public bet with Leighton Smith for a very expensive lunch at Sales Restaurant that Obama would win and Romney wouldn't. And, Leighton Smith was adamant that Romney was going to win. And, I saw it and you saw it, and we were saying, I don't think so. And I put that bet on, and Leighton Smith honoured it, paid it up. We had a very sumptuous lunch over several hours. But that was, again, a case of not looking at data, not looking at the information that was actually available to everybody, and making a judgment purely on partisan politics. And that's often the way, isn't it, that people go, oh, look, the only way to beat Christopher Hitchens is to vote for National. And I sit there and say, well, it's not the only way. There's never just one way,
No.
But if we're going to talk about negative campaigning, we have to mention Trump, don't we?
Oh, absolute genius at it, and a feral genius. I mean, I don't think there's much strategy behind it. I mean, he framed Hillary as crooked Hillary, and that was just brilliant because she had been involved in all sorts of dodgy stuff since the late 80s, and it just, and he had his crowd chanting, "Lock her up." And then they couldn't hit him for all the dodgy stuff he'd done, which was legion. So they were both equal. And, now he's calling Joe Biden crooked Joe, or the corrupt Biden crime family and stuff like that, trying the same stuff. His naming, I mean, can anyone ever look at Elizabeth Warren and not think Pocahontas?
It's just brilliant. Little Marco Rubio, he destroyed Marco Rubio by calling him Little Marco.
And low energy Jeb. And I mean, at one stage you were naming a whole bunch of New Zealand politicians. And when I found out that Jacinda had been given My Little Pony 2 Christmases in a row by her best friend, I called you up and said, Cam, look, this is going a bit far. Like, you can't, like, and so her name got changed to Socialist Cindy. And, it's sort of, it had some impact, but not really, because New Zealanders don't really hate socialists like Americans and like we do. But, that was just part of a fairly simple naming convention. And, Trump didn't work in 2020 with Sleepy Joe because it was a referendum on that wasn't, Trump wanted it to be a referendum on his record. And Biden wanted it to be a choice, and COVID let Biden go and sit in his basement, not do anything, and let Trump go out and flail away. And the public didn't really have much of a campaign, and Biden won.
Just back to the nickname for Jacinda Ardern is My Little Pony. You might be interested to know who came up with that. It was actually Paula Bennett.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and she always claims that she was above all that sort of stuff, but she's actually one of the nastiest politicians that I've ever had the displeasure of interacting with, and it was her that would do it in typical style of Paula Bennett and Bill English. They did all this nasty stuff, but they let other people say it, and they looked, they stood at the back, and it's like the naughty kids in kindy, right? They push other kids to do naughty things. It was them who instigated it, and then when it all goes south on the person who's just got caught, they go, "Oh no, I told them not to do that," And that was the thing that I always remember about Paula Bennett. She was deeply negative and deeply nasty, and
she never got caught for it. I mean, you've got to admire that. That's a real skill. I mean, how many other people do you know like that? Just wonderful to be able to get away with it in politics.
Yeah, she's lucky that that a friend of ours who's got an audio recording of a meeting with her and Simon Bridges and a friend of mine has never actually got into public, because that would reveal the true nastiness of both Simon Bridges and Paula Bennett. But they never were nasty themselves when they were campaigning. That's the thing, is they were nasty in the back room, but not actually when it came to doing it with ads or doing it in politics in an overt way. And the National Party falls down on this quite regularly, don't they?
Yeah, and that part of it is that unlike in the US, they don't really have proxies that they genuinely work with. I mean, the logical proxy for them to work with is the TU. And the Taxpayers Union, they have always kept at arm's length and thought are a bit beneath them. Groundswell, wonderful organisation, wonderful guys. National treats them with contempt rather than thinking they could be useful for running some lines for them and helping them smash Labor. It's just a degree of insularism and amateurism inside National, and it's probably also inside Labor when Helen Clark left, because she was definitely not an amateur. I mean, the way she did Shipley over was just brilliant. But National are a bunch of amateurs, and if they had been proper negative campaigners, they would have had a playbook ready for when Jacinda left, because she was always going to leave at some point. Didn't matter what point it was. But there are really only 4 people that could potentially take over, or thought they could take over, and everyone knew that it was really going to come down to Robertson, Kerry Allen, Michael Wood, or Chris Hipkins. And I remember when Robertson got quite upset with you calling him a Cardi wearing civil servant straight off the set of Gliding On. And
he just looked like Jim. He still does.
He does.
He looks like Jim out of Gliding On.
And he tweets back at you, I don't own a Cardi. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, maybe you don't own a Cardi, but you still look like a civil servant straight off the set of Gliding On. And, Kerry Allen, the rumours were legendary about her her drinking and her appalling treatment of staff well before the stories broke. I mean, they would have been able to... this isn't you don't necessarily have to be really aggressive with it. You just come out and say, "Oh, I hope Kerry can handle the pressure and she can take control of her drinking and work with staff a bit better." And there you've defined her as someone who can't cope with pressure, a drinker, and someone who's horrible to her staff.
Yeah,
and if that had been her the message about her, she would have had to struggle against those things. Michael Wood, he's just a slimy little bastard. And you just look at him and you think, mate, you can't be Prime Minister. Most people want to smack you in the face. Now, that's not politically correct to say, but it's the blink test. And the time you blink, you probably do think with that guy. And, he just reminds me a lot of Simon Bridges. And when Bridges got rolled, the word clouds about him were just horrible. And I hope you can share them, that it was dickhead, slimy, smarmy,
weasel.
Just absolutely horrible. And, that's how I would have defined Michael Wood to start with. And then I would have gone on and said something like, this bastard's useless. I mean, he couldn't build a house of cards with a bloody pack of cards and a kid helping him, let alone build light rail. I mean, where's the light rail running through his electorate? We're not closer to that than when he became minister. I mean, just absolutely useless. And, that would have been the truth, plus reflecting what most people feel about Michael Wood. I mean, if we had been managing Michael Wood, we would have got the bloody hair gel out of his hair and tried to make him look like he didn't think he was better than everyone else.
Well, that was the problem, you see, is every time I looked at Michael Wood, I saw two things. The first was Basil Brush, and I was expecting him to go boom, boom every time he said something, because he even talked the same way as Basil Brush, sort of machine gunning words out. And the second one is, I thought if you were just a little bit rounder and had a little bit thinner hair and tucked your hand into your pocket, you'd look like Napoleon. And that I said that out loud, or I wrote that somewhere, and then what I heard is that all the politicians in Wellington started calling him Little Napoleon. And that was really the undoing of him, because they hear these nicknames, and they stick, and they do, especially if they're really accurate. And, I'm guilty of giving some politicians some appalling nicknames, just playing on their name or whatever. But they stick, and that's what Trump did so well. But we're not seeing any of that from Luxon, and I think National as well are just in total are forgetting that it is a part of the toolkit to actually go negative. And when you've got Chris Bishop having a whine in the media about all these scurrilous attack ads that are going on, they're not scurrilous. I mean, it's a picture, it's a dodgy photo of Christopher Luxon with basically saying you can't trust him.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
No, it is, and it's absolutely a reflection of Labor not being able to run on their record, so they've got to run against Luxon, and Luxon's net favourables aren't good. He isn't popular with many New Zealanders. People said, oh, well, when he gets out and people know him better, they'll like him more, and in fact that was in the polls here, sort of 91% of people knew him, and his net favourables were -5, so it wasn't exactly as if he was going to become popular overnight by getting out there. And they genuinely could frame him as being out of touch and not understanding normal people. And, a guy that all his reading has been self-help books and he speaks management bullshit. If I had been bloody running Labor's internal campaign, I would have set up bullshit bingo for Parliament with the phrases that Luxon uses that are management bullshit, and have the backbenchers all yell out bingo when they filled their bingo card with his bullshit phrases. Just take the piss out of him. But, if we're going to name him, I mean, you and I had a bit of a disagreement on how we name him. I reckon he should be called Uncle Fester because he looks dead set, a dead ringer for Uncle Fester out of the Addams Family.
And I reckon he looks like Captain Underpants. And I think that kind of resonates a bit better because there's this hapless superhero, battling the evil Labour Party, but getting everything wrong along the way.
And they could have tried that. And, a really clever Labor attack, and they needed to do this when he first became leader, was get him defined as Uncle Fester. So every time anyone's seen him or Captain Underpants, they're either singing the Addams Family or, the theme for Addams Family or something like that. And, hammer his likability, not his policies, because most people don't really care that much about policies. And if you compare National's policies with Labor's, there's a chance National might implement their policies. There's no chance at all Labor will implement theirs. They're just useless, except the bad ones, the really bad ones where they create division through co-governance and stuff. They just they can't sort out school truancy, they can't fill potholes in roads, they can't build houses. They are useless.
They couldn't build a house in a room full of Lego.
Yeah, and you've got to think that hammering his likability, and that's probably where I'd criticise the CTU. They're starting to criticise policies. I would be more inclined to run a campaign against Luxon with normal New Zealanders saying Chris Luxon doesn't understand me, and giving the public a permission structure to vote against him because of what they instinctively feel. I mean, I spent the summer with people asking me, "Oh, Simon, what's going to happen in the election?" I said, "Well, what do you think of Luxon?" That pretty much sums it up. No one really knows, and Luxon isn't a good leader. And that if he was, National would be way up in the polls. And pretty much all my friends are either ACT or National voters. Some are New Zealand First voters, none of them left wingers, and they all want National to do well. And I get that. Luxon doesn't. He doesn't resonate with me. I don't really like him in the way that I like John Key. And people on the right really like Don Brash because he stood for the stuff that we believed in. But Luxon, well, I don't quite know what he actually stands for, really. And that's how I would have been running the negative campaign. So they're saying out of touch, too much risk. And I really would have been playing the man, not the ball on this. I would have just been absolutely hammering the perception that Luxon is unlikable, which the polls show. I really would just be getting normal people saying, I don't think Chris Luxon understands me. And it's just that permission structure for people to vote based on what they instinctively feel.
Well, I always like to ask women what they think about politicians, because usually it comes down to some unknown personality trait or blink test vision that they've got. So if you ask women about Winston, they generally go, "Oh, he's a bit of a silver fox, isn't he?" You ask them about John Key, they're going, "Oh, yeah, I wouldn't mind him parking his slippers under my bed." But no one, literally, that I've spoken to has said anything positive about Christopher Luxon. He's just not likable, and there's a disconnect. And I've analysed it like I do with all other politicians, and it's come down to what I consider to be inauthentic behaviour. He's got slogans that he's rehearsed and mouths, but the body language doesn't match the slogans. And so it gives you that, fleeting glimpse that this guy doesn't actually believe what he's saying. And so you get this disquiet, this unease that occurs in your mind fleetingly, but rots away. So when you actually sit down with people and say, "Well, tell me what you like about Christopher Luxon," what you usually hear is a very long pause, that you could drive a truck through before they say, "Well," and that's all you need to know. That's all you need to know about him.
And that emphasises why National probably should have been running a negative campaign against Labor, because they couldn't win on likeability. And Helen Clark was highly unpopular when she became leader. I mean, famously, she had 2% in the preferred Prime Minister polls, and she took Labor down to 14% in one poll. And she was a fine Prime Minister, but she didn't make it a presidential campaign about her. She just hammered the shit out of National, and Shipley just looked so terrible that when it came to voting day, no one really could vote for National willingly. It was a grudging vote. And Helen Clark came in and won. And that's what I would have been doing if I had Luxon's campaign, because you can't make a person likeable. It's just you either are or you aren't. You can try and make them a little less inauthentic, but that's hard. I just would have had him, look, this isn't good enough. Our country's going backwards. These bastards are wrecking it, and this is how they're wrecking it. Now, you can't take them seriously ever. And just absolutely hammer them. Just really hammer Labor on their ineptness. And I'd also make the point I wouldn't be hammering them on the stuff that the reality check radio people are really passionate about. That doesn't resonate with most of New Zealand. You look at the vaccine stats, and there's vast numbers of New Zealanders have had their vaccine. They may not have liked it, but they've had it. So you wouldn't go on about being made to take your vaccines, or you would hammer them on the lockdowns. I mean, why did we have lockdowns in Auckland? Well, because they quarantined people at risk in Auckland instead of quarantining them somewhere else where it didn't matter and Auckland wouldn't get shut down. That was just inept. But you wouldn't be going on about the stuff that your listeners all are very passionate about, because it is very much a niche position. You'd concentrate on the stuff that everyone is concerned about. There's no one sensible isn't worried about the truancy.
You can't. What you'd concentrate on would be coercion and mandates and those sorts of things, because it's completely against the Bill of Rights. But they're academic arguments that they're not even cogent supporters of absolute freedoms for everything can actually elucidate in a way that is beneficial to the lowest common denominator in the electorate. The voters on the street that are going to the factories every day. But the lockdowns definitely no, but the lockdowns do, because they lost their jobs, or they had to stay at home with their manky missus, or whatever. Yeah,
their business suffered, or they had to spend 3 months with their kids being homeschooled, and it was that kind of stuff was going to have cut through. Whereas for most of the public, the vaccine mandates aren't a big thing. The numbers are pretty clear on that. People voted by getting their vaccines, and most people did. But that doesn't mean you couldn't attack Labor for some of their ineptness. And, National really should be piling into them over their RATS tests and their masks that are hanging around. And,
forgetting to order things, all of those.
Well, that was Hipkins. 6 weeks he forgot to order the vaccines, which kept us locked down for longer. I mean, if I was in Auckland, I would have been absolutely irreparable about being locked down.
We were.
Yeah, and that was when the polls changed. Those lockdowns really hurt Labor, because they started losing Auckland, and you basically win and lose the elections in Auckland.
So with the current negative ads, let's just rip through those now and see whether they're important or not important, or effective or not effective. Let's start with Acts One, because they kind of kicked off the negative campaigning season with their attack ads against Winston.
They really need to have a good, long, hard look at themselves. That ad was a terrible ad. There's a whole lot of things you can say about Winston that would have been much more effective. But when people don't know what the ad is about, whether it's for Winston or against Winston, it's just a terrible ad. And it sort of speaks to the fact that there's a whole lot of insiders in ACT that know all this stuff, and they're probably not circulating with the 95 or 97% of the population who simply just don't care about politics and wake up at election time and have a bit of a think about it and then vote. And most of them just vote the same way. It wouldn't have got past a decent research person like Farah, and it wouldn't have got past it wouldn't have been created if they had have used focus groups to test it. There's other stuff that they could have run on Winston, but the execution and the message were just inefficient. And strategically, why are you attacking Winston? I mean, the real enemy for you is Labor and the Greens and the Maori Party. Have a crack at them. You at least in theory can work a little bit with Winston. You can't work with the others at all. And yeah, I mean, I know that they don't like Winston, but sometimes you just got to be pragmatic, and it's probably why you and I get on really well with people in Labor, because we're quite happy to whack them, and we're quite happy to take a whack back from them, and they don't take it personally. They think it's part of the game, and we're just good mates with them because they're good people, and we disagree with them, but it doesn't mean that we have to hate them.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that perhaps a little bit of act is, we hate these people, and instead of thinking, it is part of the game, you've got to take a few knocks. And why you'd spend money on effectively promoting Winston when he's below 5% at the time the ad came out, I don't know. I just couldn't really make sense of it.
Well, he's over 5% now, and every ad, every poll, so ACT has actually helped Winston. So it's a little. So we'd have to say it's a 2 out of 10 for intent and a 0 out of 10 for execution.
I'd just give him 0 all round. It's just something that a dispassionate campaign manager would have blocked straight away. It's like, come on, guys, grow up.
Focus on the target.
Yeah, and if you've really got to annoy Winston, you're far better off saying, well, Winston, you went with Labor. And that is he did go with Labor. It's true.
Yeah, it's a valid criticism. It's one that's used all the time. But ACT should have, they should have run it. You can't trust Winston. He won't honour the wishes of the majority or whatever. But they just went personal, and I don't think it worked. Especially as the photo was Winston smiling, and Winston smiling is far more appealing than Winston scowling.
Well, and far more appealing than David Seymour anyway. I mean, I'm looking at the photo now, and it's just like if Winston could have paid ACT to put a photo up, he would have paid him to put that one up.
Yeah, pick that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the CTU attack ads that were launched this week, masquerading as a front page on the Herald? I mean, there's some issues around the Herald actually allowing that to occur in the way that it did without saying, well, hang on a second, this is going to reflect on our brand as much as it is on Christopher Luxon.
Oh, look, I think the Herald is probably trying to take any money they can before they go broke. So I don't have too many problems with the Herald running those ads. I liked part of the message of the CTU ads. The out of touch part I thought was good. I'm not sure about the too much risk, because I don't think the average person thinks that the government agencies are particularly competent, and cutting money for incompetent agencies is probably quite a good thing in the view of most people. I just would have been really putting the message out there that, Luxon doesn't understand people like me. He really is out of touch. He's just not a guy that you want to go and have a beer with, and you can't have a beer with him. And, I would.
Well, he doesn't drink for a start.
Yeah. I'd have normal people saying that. I probably would have got someone who, I work for Air New Zealand, and I, as a tradie, and I left to set up my own business because I hated those rich pricks in those shiny suits that thought they knew better than me, and they all they could do in a plane is sit in a seat. They couldn't fix it, and just stuff like that, and no one wants to vote for their boss. Now, that's not quite true, but it's a message that most people would instinctively understand, like no one would vote for their mother-in-law. Yeah. It's just that I would be concentrating not so much on Nationals policies, and I really would be playing the man a lot more than the ball.
Yeah. So how do you defend against negative campaigns?
Well, the first thing you do is you don't have a sook about it. I mean, Chris Bishop, who was a gifted politician and won a seat that he had no right to win through sheer hard work and really good strategy. And you've got to admire Chris Bishop driving Trevor Mallard out of Hutt South. I mean, that is a work of a genius politician. And for him to come out and complain about it, I mean, Jesus, doesn't he understand basic rules? If someone bullies you, you don't whinge about it. You whack them back, and you whack them back hard. National should have come out straight away and been really aggressive, saying Labor can't run on their record because the record's appalling. I mean, these guys are just useless. That's why they're running against us. We're happy to run on Labor's record of failure. They failed to build light rail. They failed to build the 100,000 Kiwi build houses. They failed to buy the vaccines in time. They failed to improve our hospitals and polytechs with stupid, expensive bureaucratic reforms. They pissed away all that money on merging the TVNZ and Radio New Zealand for no real purpose. They've failed a generation of school kids who've wagged school with no consequence, and they've failed our communities by not stopping ram raids. Labor can go on as much as they like about ours, but they really should look at the mirror and see the people that have failed at every step in government and have failed New Zealanders. And smack Hipkins hard in the face about his failures and just reinforce that message and not complain about it. And they really should have. If they had been professional, they would have had that playbook ready for when Jacinda went. And, there weren't many people that could take over, and you knew the messages that you could run on the people that took over, and you could define them quickly. And the public would have largely accepted the definition because they're basically true.
That then leads to what negative campaigning should emphasise, and what you've got some thoughts on that, about what you should focus your negative campaigning on and what you should reinforce or what you should echo out there.
Yeah, and you've got to stop being cerebral about it and think about what the guy at the rugby club is thinking on a Saturday afternoon, which is generally he doesn't think about politics at all, and he has a visceral reaction to things. And like if you're campaigning against co-governance and you don't trust Luxon on co-governance because Chris Finlayson's hanging around, your negative campaign is the theme of it, and it won't quite say this, is don't let Luxon sell us out to the Maoris. You can't say that in New Zealand these days, but that's the message, and it has to be a bit more subtle. And that would be from the right, but very much the from the left, it's Luxon doesn't understand people like me, and he's out of touch. A bloke that owns 7 houses hasn't got a clue how hard it is to get a deposit together for your first house. He doesn't understand what a struggle it is to afford the school uniforms for our kids when we're paying so much in mortgage costs because we can't afford or we've bought a house and the interest rates have gone up. And ACT, and I think David Seymour has done an admirable job until the last few months where he's made a few pretty basic mistakes, but over the last 10 years he's been consistently the best around. But ACT are really pro-immigration, and the attacks on ACT are really simple. ACT means more immigrants, and immigrants will block our roads, they'll take our jobs, they'll fill our hospitals, they'll fill our schools. We can't have ACT doing that to our country. We can't have ACT in government until we've got hospitals that don't have huge waiting lists and long waiting times. We can't have ACT bringing in more immigrants when all the roads in Auckland are absolutely chock-a-block and gridlocked. We can't have low-wage immigrants coming in and driving down the wages of our workers. That would be the negative attack that you'd have a crack on with ACT. And ACT genuinely are classical liberals. They do believe in immigration, and it's the truth. It's not particularly personal, but that's how you'd attack ACT. And Seymour, and this is where one of the things that I admire him for, because he actually genuinely does have beliefs, would probably accept that he believes in immigration, and he would try and persuade people with his argument that immigration was actually good, rather than complaining about someone having a go at him over immigration. And that there's not many politicians in New Zealand who are brave enough and have the courage of their convictions to argue when something they're doing is pretty unpopular.
I thought the other day that Winston could have a bit of a crack at the other leaders because he's got his horse ad, which is going gangbusters on social media. I think it's had around 150,000 views now on Twitter. He could challenge the other leaders to, show how they can get on a horse, and you end up with a Don Brash situation. I mean, watching Chris Hipkins try and climb on the back of a horse would be just laughable, given how small and tiny he is. And watching Christopher Luxon do it would be even funnier. Or James Shaw, About the only leaders that would probably leap on the back of a horse with better skills than Winston would be the Maori Party leaders.
Well, Maribel Davidson might be able to, but and I think that if we compare it to what Helen Clark would say if someone came and asked her, she would just shut that down straight away, because it's just she was way too smart to get trapped into doing something like that. But it is it is something that probably could have happened, and it was a good ad. made Winston look happy and smiley and emphasised his experience, and he's been there before. And the big thing is that everyone looks at it and, oh, yeah, we might not like Winston that much, but, yeah, we quite like having him around. He's quite fun.
Well, he's a rascal and a scallywag, and I think we need to have rascals and scallywags in Parliament. That's my view anyway. Well,
yeah,
I think we've traversed negative campaigning in a way that people have never heard before, that there is some benefits to negative campaigning. It doesn't all have to be nasty, but the most important thing about negative campaigning is it needs to be truthful.
Yeah, and it has to be based on stuff that people instinctively understand. If they don't instinctively understand, complete waste of time. And, that's where some of the stuff that we've highlighted will show good campaigns doing good things to define their opponents.
Well, hopefully we'll have time for another analysis. We'll see if there's any more negative ads, and maybe we can do a redux of this closer to the election to educate people on whether it was successful or not successful. And, of course, the polls will show that as well.
Yep, and obviously we have opinions, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're not. But, the polls will tell us.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of feedback about your opinion about Jacinda Ardern and how people thought you were deluded because she thought she was lovely. But, that's you're entitled to your opinion. It doesn't make you a bad person because you're wrong on that one.
Well, see, so this is where I would say if those people actually got to spend some time with Jacinda Ardern and have a few drinks with her, they would find it very difficult not to like her, in the same way that Michael Cullen really wanted to hate John Key, but just couldn't because John Key was just a likeable guy, and he wanted to hate him through the debates as finance spokesman in 2005 and just couldn't help liking him. I think that, as much as people didn't like what Jacinda did, I think that if they were to go in and, have a decent conversation with her rather than just attack her and treat her as a human, they would be overwhelmed that she was actually quite a nice person, which is absolutely unusual in politics. I mean, how many nice people do you know in politics, Cam?
Yeah, not many. Look, nice people can do bad things, and that's what Jacinda Ardern did in the end. She thought she was doing the right thing, but was, it was pretty terrible. Especially
I never said I liked her politics. I just liked her as a person. I found her politics abhorrent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's good to clear that up for the listeners. Anyway, yeah. Simon, thank you once again for explaining the ins and outs of some of the darker aspects of politics, and hopefully New Zealand can, at least catch up with the Australians when it comes to negative campaigning and aim to be on a par with the Americans, because it's a whole lot more fun.
Oh, definitely. And you're just telling the truth about people.
Exactly. And truth in politics is something that is very scant these days.
Yes, yeah.
Say what you like about Simon Lusk, but he's one of the best operators in the shadowy back rooms of politics. He's certainly shared with you all today just exactly how negative campaigning can and does work. Do you think the same? Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.